So welcome, everybody. Welcome to this London Society webinar. My name is Clare Delmar. I'm a trustee of the London Society. And we're here this evening to meet the author of a wonderful book. You see it, called London Immigrant City. And it's by this wonderful author we're going to be chatting with called Nazneen Khan-Østrem. Now, before I begin, I should tell you, here's the book. You can buy this book at a discount, which the wonderful Hachette Distribution, who's the publisher, is kindly offering. Regular retail price is $12.99. You can get it for $7.79 plus postage packaging using the discount code LIC23, but you don't need to remember that because it's actually on your webinar joining instructions. So if you'd like to buy the book at the discounted price, please go to your joining instructions and follow the instructions there. Great. Now, 17 attendees. Welcome again. Before I introduce Nazneen and we have a chat about her book, I just want to mention two things. The first is there's a Q&A. If you look at the bottom of your screen, I imagine most of you are familiar now after 3 years of a pandemic with Zoom, but there's a Q&A. It's right after the record button, which you don't need to know about. But so if you just continually, put in questions, make them really interesting, make them funny, make them challenging, and later on in the discussion, we will raise those and ask them. Put your name there if you can. Anything you think is relevant to the question will be really, really helpful. And then the second thing, because I said two things, I just want to share a few comments about why I'm here, why I was drawn to this book. And I'm just going to read to you very briefly from the review I wrote about the book earlier this summer. And you can find my review on the London Society website. But I think this is better than me just kind of, off the cuff, telling you a few fun facts. So here we go. I was immediately attracted to this book for several reasons. First, the author's name, Nazneen Khan-Østrem. What a wonderful, beautiful name. Its inhabitant would very likely know her stuff and offer a perspective based on very personal experience. And as an immigrant myself to this fair city, a fellow traveler's account was of great interest to me. As I mentioned, I'm also an immigrant to London, and I grew up in another immigrant city on America's East Coast, where the narrative on immigration was carved into the base of the Statue of Liberty. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Ethnic groups stuck together in neighborhoods, setting up their own schools, churches, sports clubs, etc., and crucially, immediately defined themselves with a hyphen. The Irish Americans, the Italian Americans, the Asian Americans, they all melted into this big American pot of culture. African Americans, of course, had a very different experience, but that's not what we're here to discuss today. Now, London is very different in its immigration history, and this is reflected in its neighborhoods and communities. Much of this has to do with empire, which again is something I never knew about till I moved to these shores. And it drove the many flows of immigrants to London. And unlike the hyphenated Americans, many immigrants to London proudly wear their ethnic identity comfortably alongside their identity as a Londoner. Now, I was reminded of this late last year when, you all may recall, there was a media storm which erupted over the question, where are you from? An opinion varied on the etiquette of this question amongst Londoners, ranging from the intrusive and rude to curious and warm-hearted. Personally, I've always enjoyed responding to the question with, I'm from London. So I came to this book inspired about the past and the future of London and its immigrants, and I wasn't disappointed. And on that note, I'd like to introduce Nazneen Khan-Østrem. Welcome, Nazneen.
Thank you so much, Claire, and thank you so much for your kind words. It's lovely to be here.
So Nazneen is currently speaking to us from her home in Oslo. So why don't we just dig right in? Nazneen, what brought you to approach this topic and to research it as, forensically and as enthusiastically as you've done, and to ultimately write and publish the book?
Well, the idea goes actually quite way back, because I've been in London. I've been traveling around London since I was quite young, because I grew up basically in Guildford, and we used to travel into London. And I've always been a very inquisitive type of person. I just loved, walking around in London, looking at all the people, and hanging out with my own family, which is in London, spread all over the city. And as I grew older, I sort of realized that there was so much history and so much exciting stuff in the city. And I used to be a music journalist, so I came sort of my access to London was through the punk movement. And walking in the streets of London, there were so many record stores and cafes and Scots, and and it's just so many different type of people. And I was really excited about this, living in Norway. I felt I had my brethren were there in London. I don't know why I was attracted to this movement, but it's just the nature of the movement, which was so rebellious and full of, it was very welcoming, and you could be anybody, anyone in that kind of environment. And as I grew older, I studied, I got more obsessed about cities, because I find them as like the organisms, and you can be whoever you want, and you can, really, there's sort of layers of history in every city, and London very much so. And then as I went to London School of Economics and did my master's in international relations, and trust me, not to do the the average thing, go and write something about international order or write something about America. I wanted to do city development, and I mixed it with my international relations, because I think that is exactly what London is. Whatever happens in the world happens in London, and that sort of really intrigued me. And then you had all these communities, and having an immigrant background myself, I became quite sort of clear about all the different communities that were set in London. And in one way, they sort of kept to each other, and they kept sort of close to one another, but at the same time, they interacted with everybody in London. And this was especially evident when I visited my uncle, who lived in Wilson Green, and we would stand outside his house, and there would be people from all over the world like popping by, people, Italians and Caribbeans and from Nigeria, and they would come and talk to him. And I was like, oh my God, I love this. This is London. The whole world is in this street. And I was really excited. And then I decided, okay, I really have to write this story, because there are lots of books about Caribbeans in London or Asians in London, but there wasn't a book sort of brought these communities together. And that was something that I worked with when I went to LSE too, was the idea of migration and how it sort of shapes the city. And London would have never ever been the London we know without immigration, because it's at the core of London's DNA, basically.
No, absolutely, and I want to come back to that. But before you continue, can you tell us a little bit about your own immigrant experience? So where are you actually coming from in this whole sort of of ethnicities?
That's why I'm slightly reluctant when people ask me, where are you from? I'm like, okay, how much time do you actually have?
Yeah.
Yeah, because basically I was born in Nairobi, Kenya, and my parents were born in Kenya too. And my grandparents moved for what was then the British Empire, India, to Kenya. So it was it was at the absolutely at the height of the British Empire in many ways. And they came to work in Kenya for the British administration as civil servants. So we were, there was quite a few of us who came at that point in the 30s to Kenya. And I grew up, I was only 2 when we moved to England, but my parents were very much part of the, of the British Empire and the British Kenyan experience, which them very much, and also my rest of my family, obviously, who grew up there. So we have quite a distinct identity, and I tend to say that we are a sort of minority within the minorities, because what happened within the people who came to East Africa, they developed their own culture, their own way of being, and they tend to be quite cosmopolitan, because they lived aside people from very different backgrounds. So it wasn't sort of so much a sort of, yes, they kept to it themselves, but at the same time they interacted with people all the time. So they tend to be quite well educated, quite cosmopolitan in their outlook. So that's something I have with me in my life. I'm always sort of I would say always quite try to have a wide horizon when it comes to other people. But it's always a difficult question when people ask me, so where are you really from? And I'm like, that's a very good question.
It's really interesting on the the identity of so-called, African Asians, or however you define, because first of all, I guess those people, which were of course your parents, would have had their own kind of melting pot experience in East Africa before they even came here. So in some ways they've been kind of trained, for this experience. And as you say, they were, educated, skilled. A lot of them worked on the railroads and other things. But, just a little anecdote, obviously growing up in America and knowing a thing or two about immigrants, especially coming from Boston, which is where I did grow up. I remember when I first came to London, this was in the late 80s, and going to work in the city. And a lot of my, quite a number of my colleagues did define as Asian. Now, that is not a word that meant the same thing in America. So there was a lot of, it wasn't just, different words, which we can all laugh about. It was something much deeper, because for one thing, the Indian immigration hadn't happened in the US yet. So they didn't even really have a word for that. But what was also amazing is then I would say, where do you come from in India? And they'd look at me, with absolute, this perplexed state, because they said, well, I don't come from India. I was born here, but my parents came from Africa. And of course, in the United States, we'd never been taught about this. So, it's really quite extraordinary. It's a very different, and I want to come back to that theme of the sort of exceptionalism of London's immigrants. But I think, your background kind of typifies what certainly to Americans, which think of themselves as the ultimate melting pot, have no idea about,
Yeah.
I
So I
imagine
think,
the Indians' experience now in the United States couldn't be far, further removed from what it's like right now.
yeah, in that way, I'm happy that we have a person like Rishi Sunak as the Prime Minister, because he has also East African roots, and so does Suella Braverman, and Priti Patel also had that. So the East African Asians have made a mark in British politics, especially, and I think that there hasn't been that much knowledge about our background in Britain. Is rarely taught at schools that that there were Indians in East Africa. But thanks to Rishi Sunak and him, a lot of people now know much more about this. And also the Nobel laureate Abdul-Razak Gurnah recently received the Nobel Prize for Literature, and he's also from Zanzibar in East Africa. Right. So slowly more of us are sort of emerging of the world scene, as to say.
Well, of course, there was also the popularization, if that's the right word, of what happened in Uganda. Exactly. Through films like The Last King of Scotland and things. I mean, I think most people, and most Americans I know for a fact who saw that film, again, had jaw-dropping moments. They had no idea this ever happened. It just was something that was never talked about, or Anyway, I mean, it is fascinating. And, we keep coming back to this idea of a Londoner. And, I as I said in my intro, I self-defined as one. And, do you consider yourself one? And do you think it's an inclusive term that's open to all immigrants?
Well, I'm quite humble when it comes to defining myself as a Londoner, because I haven't grown up in London, and we've always had a second home there. So in that sense, when I get off the plane, especially when I get off at Gatwick, I do feel at home in a different way than I feel at home in Norway, because I sort of blend in much more, and I feel very much at home when I am in London. But if a Londoner, and a genuine Londoner, came up to me and said, "Oh, you're from London," I would be humble and say no. But in my heart, I feel very much attached to London. I always will be. Because I have so much family there, and I still find myself quite British. Even living in Norway most of my life, I still feel very connected, because my I would say my formative years were in Surrey, so they meant a lot to me. And then later, traveling back and forth in Norway, Norwegians have this concept of their cottage. They go to the mountains with their cottage. But when I was young, we would go to London. So my cottage is in London. So I tend to say that to Norwegian friends, that my cottage is in London. You have your cottage in the mountains. So that's the difference.
Yeah, kind of your escape, I guess. But I mean, with all seriousness, I mean, do you think the term Londoner is an inclusive one? Do you think that, and you use the word British as well. I mean, do you think that being Londoner is an exclusive from being a British? Do you think they have to be the same? I mean, what do you think about that? Do you think London is unique in that it defines its inhabitants, no matter where they originate from, as a Londoner?
I think being London is a very inclusive term, because anybody can come to London and call themselves a Londoner, and nobody will. I think it'll be very rare that somebody would say, "No, you're not a Londoner." I think you don't hear people say that. They would just smile, and then maybe ask, "Oh, why, what connection do you have to London?" It wouldn't be that you're not part of us. That would be a very rare. That would be exceptional if somebody did that. So I find London a very inclusive city. I find London is very inclusive, and I think it's very unique, because the whole world is gathered in London in a way which you can't find in any other city in the world, due to the British Empire, people from all over the world have always come to London. So there's such a special sense of connection, I think. And, that's why you have all the migrants coming, and you have the migrant crisis, because people want to come to the UK because it all has such a special role in international history and politics.
Yes, of course. I mean, so, again, on that point, do you think that the immigrant experience has been different across the UK, or maybe say it more specifically, different outside of London, but within the UK?
Oh, definitely, because it's been quite interesting, because I have been coming on holiday to London, but I've also traveled with my family outside London, and we went to like Dartmouth and around Devon, and we've been areas like that. And I've noticed then that there are not very many immigrants there. There'll be that Indian restaurant, there'll be that Chinese restaurant, but in the streets and the people living there are not immigrants. So it's very different when you go to smaller places and larger cities. Larger cities are much more inclusive, which is normal in any country, I would say. So I would definitely say that being an immigrant outside London is probably a different experience, especially if it's a smaller place. And it's quite interesting because you had like Midsummer Murders, which was a very popular crime series, and they were criticized a lot for not having any people with immigrant backgrounds in the series, because they said, obviously that now slowly there is a doctor, there will be a Dr. Patel or a Dr. Khan, even in these small villages. So they were they were basically forced to bring in people of color in these very sort of romantic series, romantic sort of come from romantic villages, and they were forced to show people of color there, which is really important, I think.
Yeah, I mean, just again, back to the comparison of London versus regions, and maybe more specifically smaller cities. I mean, on first glance, it does appear that outside of London, immigrant groups tend to be more concentrated in one area. So, I think of Bradford as a really, standout example, or Leicester, for example. Whereas my sense is that in London, there's a lot more mixing, much more of a kind of a mélange. I mean, do you think that's a fair statement?
I think so, but I do at the same time, I would say a lot of immigrant groups do tend to sort of stay within themselves. Like when I was writing this book, I was quite surprised to sort of find out how close knit lots of the communities are. Like the Italians, they take care of each other. They are strongly connected. They have their own old people's home village, which I found quite amazing. So they do, they take care of each other. They also do blend. But every community I met in London seemed to have a very strong sense of identity of who they were. But also there's a lot of friction within communities too, like with the Irish community. I noticed that especially among women, there were the older ones who were very anti-abortion, and then you have the young modern ones who are very, more on the more liberal side, and there were intense tension there. So it's quite interesting to see how they're not one big happy family. They're politically divided, values divide them. So that's an interesting aspect too. I think is important to have in the back of the head when you talk about these communities, how divided they actually can be.
But it's interesting. So in my own experience of raising children here, and picking up on your point about the Irish specifically, I'm actually married to an Irishman, so I have a little bit of experience in that community. But anyway, no, what I really want to say though is that to your point about divisiveness and maybe some tension, ironically, what I found to be something that was an incredible non-divisive sort of binder for these groups was the Catholic Church. So if you look at some of the Catholic schools, particularly at primary level, but not exclusive, I mean secondary level too, every ethnic group under the sun was represented. And I mean, your obvious candidates of the Irish and the Polish and the Italians and the Spaniards and a few French, but then you had, your Nigerians. I mean, I can go on, and you're not
exactly.
I always felt that was a really wonderful thing. It's kind of, idealistic as it sounds, it seemed to be doing something right, that this one institution, maybe it was just the competitiveness of parents wanting their children to get into schools, but everybody, I never felt that there was any kind of segregation within the school. Quite the opposite. It really wasn't about that. And again, my children are now grown, but I'm it would be interesting to revisit that. Did you come across that in any of your research?
Oh, definitely. I would say that the the church is very important for a lot of the immigrant groups, and they do tend to sort of congregate there, and it's sort of a very social place, and they have people from all over the world coming there. It's quite interesting because actually here in Oslo there's a Catholic school, and that's a very international school. People from all over the world, the people who live in Oslo, a lot of them send their children to this church because they want the international atmosphere, they want that religious education, they want the values that the Catholic Church teaches them. So it's, I mean, even in a small country like Oslo, the Catholic Church has a very important sort of international role in bringing communities together. I didn't find that so much, I would say, because the Catholic groups I met were the Polish or the Italians, and they would sort of, they wouldn't talk so much about the schools, they would talk about the churches being places where they met.
Right. Yeah. And then of course other, I guess cultural institutions, which we'll come back to, but I want to just switch slightly to something else. And again, it was something that I alluded to in my own intro about my own experience here. Obviously the title of your book is London Immigrant City. You clearly categorize London as an immigrant city. But many other cities around the world would define and describe themselves in the same way. And so, I'm wondering if what you think makes London different or even exceptional.
I would definitely say London is exceptional due to the empire, basically, because people from all over the world came to London and to start a new life or meet people who had same political affiliations as them. And what really fascinates me about London is that this goes so long way back. Like when I was, when it comes to Italians, you had fascists and anarchists in Soho in the 1920s, and they came from all over the world, and they met people which they sort of then fell in love with and created new families and new alliances. So it's sort of, I don't know of any other city in the world that sort of where the world is so strongly represented. I mean, obviously New York is a melting pot in many ways, but again, it's not the same way as in the UK, because I think people come to England and London, they see themselves as a British, right? I see myself as a British person. It's a very strong identity. But then, of course, again, because of the now after. For the last few years, there's a lot of debate about the legacy of the empire, which has become under scrutiny. So it's not that easy anymore to call yourself British, because it has it's a very controversial legacy there. And it's very interesting to have a conversation with my sons, and they say, why are you so obsessed about calling yourself British when the empire was so bloody and they really ruled in a most horrific way in the colonies and places like that. But still I have this strong connection, because Britain is more an idea, it's like a global place for me, and that's why it's a very important. There's no other country in the world, I think, that has this idea of global. And you can say what you want about Boris Johnson, but he talked a lot about global Britain, and that was a concept which I really sort of thought was really interesting. You can't say global Germany or global Norway, that doesn't work, but you can say global Britain and everybody will understand what you're talking about.
But it is interesting in the way you mentioned empire, and and obviously in its modern day incarnation of the Commonwealth. I mean, and I just want to talk about that for a minute, because I brought up a few minutes ago about the Catholic Church as an example, and there would be others. I'm really just reflecting my own experience, but the Catholic Church as a binder, and as an opportunity for these various ethnic groups to be together in a common setting and learn together. I really can't. And what you're mentioning about, the people coming because of empire and Commonwealth, you said, I think a few minutes ago, you said, they already felt British, or that, they had this idea, because they clearly had language, they had, the law, various legal and civil service institutions. They had, most of them drove on the left side of the road. I mean, there were a number of conventions, the school system, the exam system. I mean, on and on, we all know. So, and it's amazing when someone like me who, didn't grow up with this, and when you do travel to Commonwealth countries, particularly like in Africa, where I've been a number of times, and you see, the same exam system, the same level. So anyway, but my question, I'm kind of rambling here, but what I really I'm interested in is how, I think what you're saying is that the people who come here and having had that more than a familiarity, they've actually had it growing up, probably in their education and, in their work life or whatever, or just in obeying the law and having to, live a civilized life in these countries, that is very, very, very different than those who emigrate to America. And I've kind of never thought of it that way. And so I'm really interested, like, in your research and in your conversations with these various ethnic groups. And, you know, as you wrote the book, did people talk about that? Did people talk about this kind of familiarization or maybe even comfort level?
Yeah, well, it's definitely at the core of their identity, because everybody went to schools and learned about, were taught English history, you know, they were taught English. But some people, and also it's very interesting how, you know, there was a whole sort of intellectual group who went to, you know, the most prestigious universities in England, Oxford and Cambridge and LSE. And what was really interesting about them, that they went to these English institutions, but they became very radical, and they went off and started fighting the British. You know, they became anti-colonialists, but taught at the same British institutions at the same time. So there's quite a big paradox there. But at the same time, you know, I think people who come from the Commonwealth, they're so, you know, they're in many ways ingrained in the British way of thinking, so it was easy for them to come to the UK. But a lot of them have later stages also, you know, question mark their education. What did we learn? We didn't learn anything about our own history, which has been a very problematic part of this. So it's sort of, yes, we are British, but we want to know more about our history, who our people are. You know, the history of the Indian subcontinent is so complex, but people know very little about it because the British never taught them about this. They taught everything about, you know, Queen Elizabeth or whatnot. So it's sort of a very interesting sort of, I would say, a sort of paradox there, where you are British on one side, but at the other time you're also trying to work against that sort of brainwashing which has been going on in the colonies. And lots of people, you know, they told me, Caribbeans would tell me, you know, they came to Britain and they had this idea of who the British were. You know, they were all, because most of the British people they met in the colonies were people of higher ranks, and they came to London in, you know, the 50s and 60s, and they saw that the British they were just like ordinary people. They were, you know, scruffy, and they spoke weird, and they were vulgar, and they thought everybody was like really refined. So they got like a cultural shock when they came to the UK. But at the same time, they had a lot of respect because, you know, the English was their language. They had learned everything about the Queen and the British history. And also the British, you know, the British took their British history to the Caribbean and, you know, called places after historical figures in British history. So it is a very interesting sort of tension going on there, I would say, which other immigrants don't have. When they say a person comes to Germany, they wouldn't have had that type of upbringing. Or if you came to Norway, you would have never had that kind of upbringing. So the British, again, have a very unique role when it comes to the way British history was taught. Has been a very dominant force, both intellectually, language-wise, you know, history. So I would say at the moment, what's going on now with, you know, with the Windrush movement and the Black Lives Matter movement and the discussions at Oxford and Cambridge and, you know, Winston Churchill, it's all about, you know, reclaiming history. But at the same time, you're still wrapped in a sort of British cloak, I would say.
That's so interesting because, like, again, I mean, I don't want to, you know, sort of go on and on about it, but I mean, you know, when I think of, you know, the US being another, you know, defined as a melting pot, I mean, let's face it, that is the way it's defined. You know, it's very, very different experiences. I mean, it was almost by definition, everybody who came to America was fleeing something, you know, and certainly had no grounding, you know, often even in democracy, clearly, you know. And, you know, all the things you've just talked about, whether it was language or culture or educational backdrop, were, you know, completely unknown and, you know, foreign, even alien to them. So very, very different experience. And I'm really curious to know how, you know, and again, one isn't better or worse than the other. They're just very different. But what I'm curious about is how that may have played out in successive generations. So, for example, when I first came here, as I mentioned earlier, this is in the late 80s, you know, I was actually quite struck by not only how integrated I felt London was, and you've got to bear in mind, I came from Boston, and I grew up as a kid in the 1970s where there were race riots. So, you know, I kind of know what it looks like to live in an incredibly segregated, and those race riots literally came out of a Supreme Court decision to desegregate schools. So it was extremely contentious. I'm putting it mildly. And so anyway, and I think most people on this webinar, you know, yourself, most people know that, you know, America has a very different history with race. And I don't want to go on about that, but I'm simply making the point that when I first came here, There were a couple things that were really new to me. One was what I've already mentioned about the East African Asians. But the second thing was how I felt everything was so integrated, and, intermarriage, relationships, just to a different level, a different degree, and in such a positive way that, it was extremely refreshing. And I've never studied it. I mean, it was purely an observation. And I think most people would agree. And if anything, I think it's, it's cemented, what London and what this country is all about. And it's all, but what I'm wondering is if the backdrop to what you said, these people came here having known a lot of the cultural institutions, educational institutions, civil service, legal, et cetera, et cetera. Do you think that made a difference in people's ability to integrate better?
I would definitely say so. That's a big difference. It's very interesting what you're telling me about your American experience, because I have heard a lot of Americans say what you say, that they find London to be a very mixed city compared to what they experience in the US. And I have heard that from so many people. I think we basically just take it for granted in London that people mix around. But it's very interesting because different immigrant groups have had very different experiences. Like I remember when I spoke to some elderly women from Jamaica, they would tell me that they would be very, they would be welcomed, and they would go out with English men, and it just happened naturally. And you do have lots of mixed marriages among people from the Caribbean and the UK, but it was a different thing when the families came from, say, like Pakistan or India, who had a different culture altogether. That then it wasn't such a smooth thing, and it's taken time for mixed marriages in communities where there are Indians or Muslims. There's a much lower level of intermarriages going on and mixed marriages going on there, because it's culturally very different. And I remember it very distinctly, this Jamaican woman telling me that she noticed when the first Indians and Pakistanis came to England, the women would not sort of mingle with them because they culturally were so different. The Caribbeans were much more culturally, they used to go out and dance, and they would hang out in pubs, but you wouldn't have people from the Indian subcontinent doing that because it was culturally alien to them. So their life was at home, while other immigrant groups had their life, at the pub or outside on the streets. So there are some deep cultural differences there, which are quite interesting, because they just didn't have the same references. It would be abnormal for a Pakistani Indian woman to go to a pub and hang out, but a very common thing for somebody from Jamaica to do. So it's that's quite sort of interesting. But then again, you did have Jamaicans and Indians marrying in Jamaica in the Caribbean, so they had their own culture going there. So there's so many nuances when it comes to how the sort of integration works and does not work, and who gets married and who doesn't get married. So there's a lot of that once you start sort of actually, pulling the pieces apart when you actually study different groups, which I find really interesting. Like I wrote a Polish chapter on how difficult it is for some of the Polish women to marry people from Caribbean background. And there are small tensions within each community going on all the time. So it's not one big happy family in London.
Yeah, no, I want to come back to that, but I just want to pause for a moment and just suggest to our attendees that I haven't seen anybody post questions on the Q&A, and please do that, because I know Nazneen is very keen to take questions. So if you are finding this discussion interesting and you'd like to ask a question, please do so. We have about 20 odd minutes left, and we will devote as much time as possible to these questions, but we need them to come. So anyway, back to the conversation, but please do post the questions. But so back to the intermarriage and the overall integration. I mean, again, does this kind of draw on something we talked about earlier, which is the role of religious and educational institutions that and again, I'm using America as a comparison. I mean, I'd be the first person to hold my hand up and say, don't use the word America about this huge nation of 350 million people, because there are differences with it. Having said that, there are a lot of things that are very similar, especially amongst how immigrant groups are how their experience has panned out and continues to pan out, and not only their experience but outcomes. And so I'm interested in what you found in your research that did you find that most of these groups had sort of similar outcomes? And by that, I mean, similar life chances, opportunities to be educated, opportunities to develop a profession, opportunities to, have a decent home. I mean, the things we now would consider basic rights. I mean, did you feel that that is something that is, particularly opportunistic for immigrants to London? Because I can certainly comment on how that plays out in American cities. So I'm very curious what you found out.
Well, basically, I would say there is I mean, there's no doubt about that sort of racism is a huge part of the immigrant experience, and it especially sort of struck the people from the Caribbean very hardly as they came here. The lack of many times the women were lucky because they came and worked in the National Health Service. The men, a lot of them were not so lucky, and they experienced a lot of racism. And everybody knows about these plaques and in the windows when no Irish, no blacks, no dogs, which was very quite common in London in the 1950s. So a lot of the men struggled because when there was an economic crisis, the men would lose their jobs. So they were hit very hard, and that is something which is sort of the Caribbean community has struggled with for a long time, and they're still struggling. And it was really interesting. Like Steve McQueen had the series Small Axe, where he sort of showed that through these movies the challenges and the struggles that the Caribbean community had, which was really touching and very interesting to watch. And also the riots in Brixton in the early 1980s was a result of this. There's also riots several times even before that in different cities in England due to racism. So that is one group which has struggled immensely and continues to struggle, which has been quite a depressing, I would say, story. And obviously with the Windrush scandal that really showed how deeply and systemic the racism the Windrush generation have experienced. That has been a very dark chapter in British history. When it comes to the other groups, there I would say that obviously racism has been rife, there's no doubt about it, but people who have managed to sort of, even people who are highly educated, have talked about experiencing racism in the matter of sort of climbing in the hierarchy of the British society. But now with people like Rishi Sunak and people like Sadiq Khan, who's the mayor of London, it shows it's possible. But it's many times it's been a tough ride to the top, and I get to hear people not talk about racism in some sorts, even be it the Italians or if it's the Russians or the Irish. Everybody has had that experience of racism and discrimination through their lives, and it still affects the generations now. So it's been quite sort of I was talking to the Italians, and they had kind of stereotypical ideas about Italians was very, especially in the 80s and 90s, it was very strong. It's been, that part was very depressing when I was doing my research of my book, how much discrimination, racism, immigrant groups have been subjected to in England. So I had periods when I went into sort of quite a deep depression when I was working with the book. I was like, oh my God, what people have managed and what they've experienced and how hard they've worked to create the communities, create good lives for themselves. Women in many times have had double discrimination and really tough lives. Sometimes they've been on their own, no husbands, and they've sort of really worked hard to create a good life for themselves and their children. So it was very, I knew it was there, when you actually go so deeply into the research and you get to, people tell you their stories about what they've experienced. It's sort of mind-boggling and very painful. So
in a sense of a few minutes ago, you used the word hierarchy, but you were sort of talking about it in the context of the the English hierarchy and about ethnic groups kind of climbing up through that. But I want to just sort of put that in a slightly different context, which is, did you get a sense of a hierarchy within immigrant groups? That we came here first, and that I mean, I can certainly speak to that in where I grew up in Boston, and I promise I won't, but I'm very curious if you saw and observed any historical or present sense of hierarchy or even competition between between these immigrant groups.
I think that it became very evident to me because when I started working on my book, it was in the middle of Brexit, and Brexit sort of just whirled up so much tension among immigrants. And I remember reading about a play about how there was a Caribbean man, and his daughter had got a Polish woman to come and help him, and he saw himself as a first generation immigrant, and she was like third, fourth generation immigrant, and he didn't regard, she wasn't worthy of him, and she was sort of, so there became this really strange again, hierarchy among immigrants. And I noticed even that with my own friends, I would like, we were like, but they came here later, so they don't have the same, the belonging as us.
Yeah.
But a lot of them didn't have, because I think also the fact is that some of the newer immigrants don't come from the empire, so they have a different connection to the UK. But I was very disturbed at the way Brexit sort of whirled up all these, sort of divisive mechanisms among immigrant groups. And that sort of shocks me how that sort of really surfaced, even among the most unlikely communities. I remember again with Italians, suddenly it was like anti-Europe, and then the Italians felt very European, and then the British were like, we'll go to the Italian restaurants and we'll hang out with the Italians, but we don't want them in our country. And it was just so much, tension, which was really ugly during the whole Brexit period, which I think is very destructive for destructive for London.
Yeah.
And I was shocked how deep that actually went and how many groups were affected by it. So it was not a pretty sight what was going on those years.
Yeah.
And still is not pretty.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm actually seeing that we do have a few questions. So before we take those, I just want to ask you my final question, and just a little bit more upbeat, because I appreciate what you're saying has not always been a very happy story, and continues and in both directions. So my final question is, how do you see the immigrant story in London playing out in pop culture and in tourism? Do you see this, is this a big advantage of London, which I think it is, but I'm really curious to hear what you have to say.
Oh, definitely. I mean, again, culture and immigrant culture, if you can call it immigrant culture, I would just call it London culture, because it's just a huge hybrid culture where everybody brings in their stories, their sort of ideas. And especially now, London is such an exciting city to be when it comes to sort of the culture, the music, the theatre, the dance. It's such a unique production of and a mix of all the cultures that have come to London. And they create new cultures. It becomes sort of a very unique hybrid London culture, and that's why I think people come to London to experience this very unique cosmopolitan global thing. The most unlikely of cultures emerge and mix in ways that you don't find in any other cities. So I mean, I know people say, oh, Paris or Berlin, but I mean, nothing beats London when it comes to that kind of hybridity, which exists all over. So it's very very, very unique, and very, I would say, the best in the world.
Well, some of it has indeed made, the national stage, and certainly in films and in music.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, British culture or London culture has always been dominant internationally, because you have that, it has a global outreach, which is so unique in every way, even though obviously there are lots of interesting things going on in the US too. But I would say, there is so much, so many amazing actors, musicians, all coming out from London.
Yeah, and writers. I mean, so like
absolutely.
The two cultures that really strike me on this front would be, obviously the South Indian culture, South Asian, whether it's Pakistani or Indian, but also Nigerian. And so for example, the writer Chimamanda Adichie, I'm sure, I hope people on this webinar are familiar with her. If not, please do become familiar, because she grew up in Nigeria but lived in London and then immigrated to America, and has written extensively about the difference between the Nigerian experience in America versus here. And I think part of a lot of the questions I've been asking have been very much inspired by her own writing. And another book, if you haven't read it, is her, I think it's 10 years old now, called Americana. That's Americana, which I think is going to be made into a film. But she touches on a lot of these issues, and I think it's I look at those two cultures and see they're more recently they have immigrated to America, but traditionally, and again, back to empire and Commonwealth, their natural immigrant home is here. And I think they have a very unique perspective just because of the numbers,
Absolutely.
Group. All right, well, look, there are two questions here, so I'm very excited to see. We have Richard Morse, who asks the following question. He says, have you noticed that some groups, such as Chinese or Japanese, like to stick together and use services provided by their countrymen or women?
I haven't done much research into the Japanese or Chinese. You know, I already had so many immigrant groups in my book, and it was very difficult for me to choose. So unfortunately, I had to leave the Chinese and the Japanese out of my research. But I think, you know, I think it's a lot to do about trust. And if you sort of tend to be safe with your own community, it's about speaking the same language, understanding each other's cultural values, which I think makes people sort of maybe stick together, that you feel automatically sort of safe maybe with a community that understands your language and the way of life, which you might not understand with a different group. So I have a lot of respect for that when that happens. The problem is when if you sort of become if it becomes sort of a feeling of superiority, or feeling that, you know, you're better than them, then that becomes a problem. But as long as it's sort of about I would say respect, then I don't find it such a big problem.
The next question is from Anthony Gristwood, who wants to know, in what ways do you think the creative industries in London, e.g. theatre, music, fashion, art, etc., contribute to the migrant experiences amongst the various migrant groups? So that's a very interesting question, because I know a few minutes ago we did speak about culture, you know, embodied in the music, fashion, theatre, etc. But I think we talked about it in a way about how the immigrant experience has shaped, you know, what we kind of export or enjoy in London and that. But I think what Anthony's asking is, how does it contribute to the migrant experience here? And that's a very good question, and I think it's a very interesting one. Do you have thoughts to share on that?
Well, I would like to go quite sort of to the beginning of what I was talking about. You know, when I got involved in the punk movement, it was a very interesting thing, because you had the Caribbean music coming in and merging with the punk movement, like with a band like the Clash. And you had, you know, they wouldn't be there without the Caribbean music from Jamaica and the sound system and all that music. So, you know, that the marriage of the British culture with the Jamaican culture has been absolutely essential for British you know, development of British culture, and it's also part of the migrant experience. And that's sort of been part of the whole British music industry, has been absolutely dependent upon this sort of mix of the migrant. And it also you know, if you go to a place like Peckham, you'll have, you know, people from some West Africa, and you have the Caribbeans, and they create their own sort of very unique London music scene, which is very much, again, a product of migration, which would never be there. So it's sort of there's so many arenas where you can go in and experience storytelling, you know, through the literature, through the music, through the theatre, which is so unique to London and only happens due to the migration experience. And a lot of my book has a lot of references to popular culture, because it's, you know, it sort of immerses my whole story about London, and it's still very important for, you know, what is a Londoner. I would say. So it's absolutely totally, you know, integrated in the migrant experience.
Yeah. No, I think it. I mean, and there was even a movie that came out, I think it was last year, and I can't remember what it was right now. And I remember the reviews were sort of, you know, mixed, sort of saying, oh, this is, you know, a little bit twee, I think was but it was a movie about a couple that meets in Peckham. In fact, I think the movie had Peckham.
Yeah, I know. I heard about that one. I haven't seen it yet. I'm really curious.
And I think it was a relationship. Yeah, I think it was a relationship that evolved between, you know, I think, you know, possibly a Nigerian or a, you know, a Black African, and then I think an Asian. I'm not sure, but it was something like that. But the idea was that it was a very London, very Peckham.
Yeah, I was hearing that somebody was worried that it would destroy Peckham the way Notting Hill destroyed Notting Hill.
Yeah, I hope not. Yeah, I actually did wind up seeing it. I to be honest, I kind of liked it, but that probably reflects more my, you know, romanticism and feels. Okay, the final question is from Tony Zellinger. And he says, in your book, do you explore how immigrants have moved from one district to another over time? And in the process, the existing working and lower class groups often moved to other neighborhoods, often to the edges of London, where in a sense, they became new migrants, for example, within London's new and expanded towns. Very interesting question, because we've touched on some of these issues about hierarchies, about, you know, increases in status and wealth, and also about London and outer London. So I think he kind of embodies all of those in this question.
Well, I have to say, I haven't That's a tricky question, because some of the migrant communities I talked to, like the Italians, they would, a lot of them would come to live in central London, and they would move to the outskirts as they became wealthier, which is a very typical thing. You'll move up to suburbia where you have a better quality of life, larger houses, things like that. But a lot of the Polish community, they would stay in Ealing. The first wave of Polish immigrants after the war, they came to Ealing and stayed in Ealing. So they became, they were in a wealthier, because of their middle class background, they would stay in a wealthy area. When it comes to the Caribbean communities, they're quite spread out in certain parts of London. They were a lot of them in South London, but then you also have communities in West London. So they haven't moved that much as such, and I haven't gone so much into detail how different communities have grouped. It's very many times it's about they're climbing that socio-economical ladder, which will send them away from their original place of moving. But again, like in Notting Hill, there aren't that many Caribbean families left. A lot of them have moved out, and I have met Caribbeans in Notting Hill who have said, they meet people and they ask them, why are you here? And they will look at them and say, I was here first.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we haven't used the G word in this conversation, i.e. gentrification, but I imagine that has come up too. And actually, I wouldn't mind touching on that in a minute, but I'm just conscious of time. And we have another question from Mark King, who asks, do you feel that global hits such as The Crown, you're referring, I guess, to the Netflix series, I'm sure you've seen, are unhelpful to that image of multicultural London that you speak about?
Well, I have quite a critical approach to The Crown. I didn't like it very much, which is not strange with the kind of background I have. And I think it's sort of, I don't know, The Crown was a very sort of glossy version of the whole empire and the Queen. So I have a big problem with that, and so it sort of. It was quite interesting, because when I published my book, a lot of Norwegians were watching The Crown, and they were obsessed with Great Britain, and they were obsessed with the British royal family. And I was saying, this is not Britain, this is not the real world. And then they read my book and they saw a different London, they experienced a different London, and they were very grateful for that. And I'm like, but this is so in your face. But The Crown was not helping. It was not telling the story of the multicultural Great Britain, and also the way I find London. That wasn't that evident in that kind of series. So, but it was definitely, the perfect thing for anybody who loves that sort of that Britain, because that's another Britain in many ways.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, we really only have about 3 minutes left. I really just wanted to ask you, Nazneen, if there's anything you would like to say that you maybe even read something from your book, or something we haven't talked about. I know we've covered a lot of topics, and we could probably spend another hour or two talking about even more, but unfortunately we don't have that time. But is there something you'd like to say before we draw this to a close?
No, I would just basically like to say that I appreciate our conversation, and I think what I really find important about London is the enormous mix of immigrant groups that exist there. I've only touched upon a few of them, and there's so many more. There's so many people from Latin America coming to the UK, and their stories, and there's so much interesting stories to be told. So I really want people to open up their eyes. I'm always, in my book, I'm harping about when you walk in a London street, there's so much history. Even in this shortest street in London, there will be so many people who have stories to tell. So that's always been my sort of ambition with the book, is to make people aware of the legacies that exists in every street in London. So I hope my book will open the eyes to the sort of unofficial stories of London, not just the official stories. That's probably what my hope is with the book.
Well, I hope so too. I mean, I can certainly say, I very much enjoyed reading it, and I'd also just finish by saying, which I probably didn't mention in my review, but I'll add it now. It's the kind of book that you don't just read once. It's the kind of book that is really lovely to have on a bookshelf, because you might discover a new neighborhood in London, even if you've lived here for 30 years like me, and then you sort of say, oh gosh, I wonder what Nazneen had to say about this group, or
Well, thank you so much,
It's
Claire.
almost like a reference book, and I really do urge and encourage everybody to dip into that, especially at that discounted price that I mentioned earlier. So, Nazneen, you know, on behalf of myself and on behalf of the London Society, I want to thank you so much for joining me this evening. It's been really lovely. I hope we have a chance to talk again.
Thank you so much, Claire. It's been a lovely conversation. Thank you so much.
And I'd like to thank all of the attendees who've I guess I hope you've gotten a lot out of this and you've asked some really interesting questions. And finally, I'd like to say a special thank you to Romina Illems from the London Society, who's been behind the scenes putting this event together. So thank you all for doing that. And before I sign off, I've been asked to plug a few forthcoming London Society events. These are all within the next few weeks. Next week, or on the 20th, is a webinar on the future of high-rise housing. Housing is, I think we all know and agree, is probably one of the most topical issues we're all experiencing right now in London. So that will be hosted by June Barnes and Andrew Baharo, and will raise important questions about the future of our city and those living in high-rise towers. The second one I'd like to mention on the 30th of September is a walk. And again, this will be very close to Nazneen's heart. It's a Brixton street art walk, celebration of a community. Angela Morgan will be leading this. So those of you who have been inspired by Nazneen's discovery into the immigrant communities and Brixton in particular, this is your opportunity to go there. And then on the 3rd of October is an in-person event. And I'm going to give a very special plug to this because I've sort of curated it and I will be hosting it. It's actually an interview with someone called Sir Michael Marmot, which some of you may have heard of. He is the author of the study both in 2010 and then again in 2020 on health inequalities in London and also across the country. And what he has to say and what he's been studying is extremely topical as we, you know, move forward with both an aging society, with a highly unequal society, and with an NHS that's really struggling. So this will be an in-person interview. Michael will give a lecture on his work on health inequalities, and then I will be interviewing him after, and I'm sure we'll have some Q&A. So that's it from me. Once again, thank you to everybody for joining, and we look forward to seeing you at a future London Society event.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.